I think that there's places where we can take risks in the architectural space and still relay what the brand message is, and other spaces where you're more introducing somebody to the brand and you're using materials that speak back to that.
You're listening to Retail Remix, your inside access to candid conversations with the people shaping retail's future. Here's your host, Alicia Esposito.
Hello, everyone. I'm Alicia Esposito, VP of Content for Retail Touchpoints, and I am super excited to have someone new with us on the show, Nicki Gitlin, who is founder of Dang. Nicki, I'm so excited to have you on. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to chat.
Yeah, anytime we have folks in the world of design and architecture, it definitely gets a lot of interest from our readers, our viewers. So let's dig in. Let's start with your background. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and maybe what ultimately inspired you to start Dang?
So I've actually given this a lot of thought, like how I got to where I am today with my work being in residential and retail design. It's always like interesting to think back to where it all started, how I got here. And I think it really stems down to my interest in daily routines and planning. You know, I still use a written planner. I love putting down a to-do list, crossing things off. I get really excited about when I get my new planner and setting that up for the next year. All that to say, back to design, when I was in architecture school, I went for my master's in urban design afterwards. And that's when I really became interested in how people interact with their environment. And whether it be like at the smaller scale in your own home or interacting in the retail space, like shopping, and all of that becomes either like very personal, but has to be for everybody or really who your target audience is. And then at the larger scale, your built environment, like the cities that you experience where you live. And I really love designing spaces for people. And I think that retail and residential design both allow me to dive deep into people's routines, like discover what people need and what they want and the type of spaces that they want to be in.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that idea of liking the process of productivity, right? Being able to write things on your list and check things off. So as a fellow planner, I definitely relate to that. But the one thing that really stood out to me as I was prepping for this chat today is on your site, you note that your goal is, and in any space you design or create, that your goal is for someone to enter that space and think, dang, which is very, I think, appropriate and something that I myself have experienced and felt going into certain environments. So I guess my question for you is, in an ideal scenario, when someone says, dang, like, what does that mean to you? Like, what are the feelings? Like, what do you hope to evoke once you go through that creative process?
I appreciate that you really like the name. It took a lot of like playing with the letters, creating an acronym that I wanted to, let out my personality and like for clients to be able to see like, okay, like this is fun and playful and like still accessible as design goes for, everyday life, everyday people. You're always designing for the people who are in your spaces. And so what I think about dang, and when people enter a space and like think, okay, yeah, dang, like that's a great space. Like I just really wanted to be something that like makes sense, that is a space that people feel comfortable in and want to discover, really want to spend time in. And I feel like when things come together, when things are planned really well, you kind of think like, okay, yeah, dang.
Yeah. So how does that translate to your approach as a designer, as someone who is making the plans and the decisions around light, materials, all of those tactical aspects that really go into in this case, a retail environment, right? Because I think all of our viewers and listeners, they're of the mindset of, we want to create a space that our consumers love, that not only relates to them as individuals and how they want to shop in this case, but it also relates to the brand, right? And really represents what the brand is all about. So how do you kind of keep all of that in check with all of these tactical elements? Like, do you look at the design process or, developing a strategy in a certain way?
Yeah, all my designs start kind of in the same place, a conversation with the client. In this case, really understanding a brand's message. What is the story that they're trying to tell? And how can that story be translated into a built space? And how that space translates to the customer and how they experience it. In terms of materiality and lighting and all of the things that go into the architectural built space, they really need to translate from that initial brand message. So I consider the site constraints, the locality, how familiar somebody might be with that brand in that specific location. And we come together with materials and lighting to develop that. So for example, working in-house at Theory in my previous job, we really needed to get across the brand message of a store being minimal and for this like city type person. And that translated differently in different locations. Like in Manhattan, somebody is more familiar to the brand. And so it was easier to take risks in the design. For example, a store that's fully concrete with maybe more like subdued lighting versus in the suburbs, you kind of want like the materials to be maybe more precious, like introducing more stone and things like that to relay to the customer that this is a luxury brand and this is like clothes that you wear either like where you're going to work or like somewhere nicer and things like that. So I think that there's places where we can take risks in the architectural space and still relay what the brand message is, and other spaces where you're more introducing somebody to the brand and you're using materials that speak back to that.
That's really interesting because we've been hearing so much about brands that are not only trying to create that consistent experience at the brand level, right? Through color palette, materials, but then there's also the need to localize that experience to different audiences or to different locations. And I think you're showing that nuance and how that can be executed upon effectively. So thanks for that. I guess going deeper into that collaborative process with your client, you said it always starts with a conversation, right? Going through all of those different aspects that you need to know in order to build that foundational strategy. And I'm curious, what separates the successful partnerships from the not so successful ones? Like in terms of how you work with brands, what that collaborative and creative process looks like. Are there any big call-outs, I guess, for the folks listening to this right now or watching this right now that maybe are looking for design partners and architecture partners and want to make sure they set that foundation appropriately?
Yeah, I think foundation is the perfect word. It kind of is like this relationship that you're trying to set up a foundation. You want to build trust between the client and the architect. So it starts with the conversation because you don't know what the client needs yet. You have to set up a set of parameters, rules to follow for the design. And those rules are set up through understanding what the client needs. So that's where we always start. And there's always a back and forth talking between what the client needs and taking in everything that they tell me and then me relaying it back to them on how I envision that space for them. And I think that it's important to build this trust between the two so that you can develop the brand message into the built space without watering down this design concept that you come up with. I think that the most successful projects are when there's a great amount of trust between myself and the client so that we can take design risks and move forward with design to really relay that brand message and tell the story through the space. I think when it becomes a little bit less successful is when we agree that this is the design that we're moving forward with and this is how we're going to relay that message. And then it's kind of like the client might get a little bit cold feet, like, no, this is not what I'm seeing with other retail spaces, or like gets a little bit worried about taking these kinds of risks to tell their story. And that design concept, the set of rules that we've created from the start get a little muddied. And when a customer visits the space, they don't really understand like what the brand is trying to say because it's not as clear as maybe it once was when we first started the conversation. And I think brick and mortar, it's more difficult to get that across, let's say, than like online and online spaces because it's a built space. It's not as easy to make an alteration.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And looking at your portfolio, beyond your work with Theory, there's some really great project examples from different types of brands and different sizes, statures. So Kith to Billionaire Boys Club. It was really interesting to see how your creative process and the execution can kind of flex and go in all these different directions. But I'm curious, based on your brand / retail work today, are there any common trends that you're seeing, like in terms of their goals, even their challenges, right? I mean, I'm sure like we're all trying to build around this evolving consumer, right? But in terms of actual design, store experience, are there any commonalities that really emerge that you see as standard trends today?
Yeah, for sure. I think that all these brands, it's kind of like one formula that's changing, and the outcome, all the brands want the same thing. They want customer loyalty and, of course, sales. And the way that we get there is what changes throughout. And I think that I'm able to work with all these different kinds of brands and give a different product in the retail space to each one because we're listening to how do we grow your client base? How do we keep your existing clients? And how do we showcase that, like, this is what we're trying to say with the brand message? So I think the commonality between all of the stores is telling a story, and that story obviously changes. So I think that the goals like creating brand loyalty, a customer loyalty, that comes from a confidence in the retail space, in the built store, showing that this is who we are as a brand and we stand by that. And I think that the customer is smart. You can't fool them by, let's say, copying something else in the store because they can tell when something is similar to something else, and they can tell when a brand is like being true to itself. And I think that translates into the store experience, whether it be the way that the product is displayed or the way that salespeople interact with the customer, the things that the store offers, and how the design allows for all of that to happen. And when it's a seamless experience, I think the customer feels comfortable and they feel confident in shopping there. If you're going to be spending a lot of money or even just buying something and wearing it, you want to wear it proudly, that knowing that this brand is confident in their own product as well.
Mm-hmm. And then from like a design perspective, is there anything that you've seen in other projects, or maybe you've had recent work that kind of sparks your creative fire, so to speak? Like I know I personally, like we've been tracking so much around sustainability in store design, and it's been really interesting to see how that translates into tangible design decisions and partnerships. And then like as someone who's not a designer and like doesn't have that background, and it's just interesting for me to see how something that feels so big like sustainability can be translated into something very specific and actionable for certain teams. But is there anything that you're seeing or anything that you're tracking in your work that you find to be especially exciting, or even as a consumer, right? Like maybe you've had a recent brand experience that you thought like, oh, wow, like I really am loving how they're conveying this brand story or they're laying out this experience so it's super seamless.
Yeah, I think sustainability is super important, especially when retail is like constantly changing. And you want something that is long lasting because that also makes it more sustainable, right? I think that a customer experience that kind of is sustainable in a way because it allows for the retail space to have multifunctions is over the past few years, it's been popping up having a coffee shop in a retail space. And I don't know if you've seen Ralph Lauren does this with Ralph's, how they have the coffee shop in the front and then you walk through and they have the retail space back there. And it's kind of this multifunctional, like maybe part of the space opens earlier because people are coming in to get coffee. And then the rest of the space opens later when people are coming in for shopping. And I think a few brands do this really well. And it feels very true to their brand. And I think that's also what keeps people as loyal customers because it doesn't feel like a forced collaboration between the two. That's definitely something that as a consumer, I love because who doesn't want to grab a coffee and sit in a beautiful space where you love the product as well, and then be able to shop in the space. And then as a designer, that's very exciting to me because I love combining different functions and thinking about how a space can be used like throughout the day, going back to somebody's daily routine and planning for a space to be more sustainable in its use.
Yeah, that's definitely a really fun trend that we've been tracking. This idea of like, what does experiential retail really mean for certain brands? And I think for, like Ralph Lauren and like Saks does some really interesting moments that are more hospitality driven. I know we've covered, I think it was Tiffany, their new Fifth Avenue store has art really embedded into that experience. So it feels more like a gallery. So again, I think those are like very different examples, but then also very similar because they all aligned those non-retail moments to really represent the brand still. Like Tiffany is like, you can just spend hours looking at their jewelry, right? So having art to kind of complement that and really make it a true museum-like experience. I don't know. It's definitely interesting to see how brands are pushing creative boundaries, but also like doing so in a way that feels very intentional and strategic for the brands. But I do want to go back to one point you mentioned earlier around when you're going through projects, you really want to make sure everyone's aligned and on board, I guess you could say, with the creative process, because once you design something, you can't really change much, right? It's not like digital. And I guess, for the folks watching and listening to this conversation that maybe haven't ventured into brick and mortar or are somewhat new to it, they have these really strong digital roots that are driven by agility and being able to make changes on the fly. Is there anything else that you would share with them, advice, guidance, tips to help them best prepare and, ensure that these store experiences like really shine for them? I mean, this could be a very big question because it varies from brand to brand, but, maybe there's some like hallmark advice or final takeaways that you can share.
For sure. I think that you want your online presence to translate into the built space. You don't want to water down your brand message. The risks that you're willing to take online, think about those in the built space. It is easier to take those risks online because you inherently have a larger spread of people that you can reach because it's not based on locality. And it is easier to make changes. But if you are confident in your online presence, have that same confidence in how your brick and mortar space is designed, because it's really your only opportunity to control how your client interacts with your brand. You have their full attention. They're in your filled space. So take advantage of that.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. There's like that level of intention and focus there because they're in your environment. Excellent. Well, Nicki, this has been super interesting. Thanks again so much for taking the time out to chat with me. If folks want to learn more about you and your work, where can they go?
They can visit my website. It's dang-arch.com or on Instagram, Dang Architect.
Awesome. Well, Nicki, really appreciate you taking the time. Loved getting your perspectives on what's happening in store design, how you approach these projects. It's definitely a very interesting time in this world of brick and mortar. So appreciate you joining us and, of course, sharing your insights.
Thanks for having me.
And to all of you, definitely stay tuned for more conversations like this one with Nicki, where we dig into what's trending in retail and, of course, what's new and next for the industry. Stay tuned. Head to the Retail Think Tank Hub for the latest and greatest content. And of course, be sure to sign up so you can get all of the latest updates when they're available every week. Thanks again, everyone. We'll see you next time. Take care.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Retail Remix. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can find us on your favorite podcast player. Until next time, keep mixing it up.